The business-class cabin on the flight from São Paulo to New York hung in an odd silence, the kind you only notice when it stretches on a little too long. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside the cabin, the usual rustling of magazines and polite murmurs seemed held back, like something was waiting to happen. The silence was broken by the steady footsteps of Teresa, a veteran flight attendant with over 20 years at Liberty Air. Her movements were precise, practiced. She scanned the aisles with a kind of detached focus, the kind that comes from years of showing up and staying quiet, even when everything inside is tired. She reached row 3, seat A, where a tall man in a navy sweater sat calmly, legs crossed, hands folded neatly on his lap. His name was Arturo Delgado, according to the manifest. Teresa didn't recognize him right away, but he had that look, someone used to being listened to. He raised his head slightly when she stopped. "Excuse me," he said, not loudly but clearly. "I believe I was supposed to receive the vegetarian meal I requested online." Teresa checked her tablet. A delay in the network had scrambled a portion of the passenger requests. She'd already had to deal with a lactose-intolerant woman who got handed lasagna and a businessman who shouted about his gluten-free option missing. With Arturo, though, it wasn't the complaint that got to her. It was the way he said it. No anger, no dripping sarcasm, just a quiet expectation to be treated with the same efficiency everyone else received. And somehow, that dug under her skin more than shouting ever could. That kind of poise, Teresa didn't see it as polite. She took it in that moment as condescension, like he was challenging the chaos she was managing, putting a spotlight on her while everything else was falling apart. She tightened her jaw. He nodded slightly, not backing off. "I'm sure it was just an error. I'd appreciate whatever can be done." It happened so fast she didn't recognize herself doing it. A slap. Sharp, not loud, but enough. His face turned, shocked more by the act than the sting. Around them, heads snapped up, phones came out. It was all over before anyone said a word. By the time the plane landed, the video was already looping through social media, jumping oceans, inviting opinions from people who'd never set foot on that flight. Inside the cockpit, First Officer Marcus adjusted the flight controls with routine precision, eyes moving between the monitors. Everything was smooth until the cabin buzzed, with that offbeat rhythm of sudden tension. He turned his head slightly when he heard a muffled murmur over the comms, then a knock from the purser. She leaned into the doorway just enough to whisper something to the captain. Someone filmed a flight attendant hitting a passenger, seat 3A. At first, he thought it couldn't be right. That kind of thing didn't happen, not here, not with Liberty Air. Marcus turned to the captain. "Wait, 3A. Wasn't that Arturo Delgado? You saw that press release last week, right? He's the new CEO. The captain's face tightened, but he didn't say much. A glance passed between them was enough. They decided quickly, without chaos, continue the flight without making a scene, land, and then let upper management handle it from the ground. No announcements, no mid-air drama. The weight of what had just taken place hadn't sunk in yet, but they both felt it hovering quietly over everything. Back on solid ground at JFK, the sequence of reactions moved quickly. Heads of operations and public affairs looped into frantic. Group calls, legal preparing statements, media teams trying to soften what had already spiraled online. Amid all this noise, Arturo slipped away from the expected protocol. He turned down the security escort waiting at the gate. His only request was simple: a face-to-face meeting with the customer service team. "No titles," he told the company. Aide who met him outside baggage claim. "No announcements. I just want to see how the team responds without knowing they're being watched." That was Arturo's quiet way. Never explosion, just focus. Even hours after the slap, he hadn't raised his voice. He didn't seem angry. If anything, he was curious. He wanted that meeting not because he needed apologies, but because something in the moment, in Teresa's reaction, in his own calm, had exposed a deeper crack. He walked into the side building, near Terminal B, where the customer support workers took calls and processed complaints. No one there knew his face yet. They were too busy dealing with incoming reports from Flight 739. Arturo took a seat in the back, notebooks closed. He was not observing damage, he was seeking understanding. Within hours of landing at JFK, the video had already traveled far beyond the airport. It showed only a few seconds. Teresa leaning forward, her hand striking Arturo's. No face, his head turning slightly, stunned but composed. No sound but the gasp from another passenger. That short clip, shaky and grainy, exploded across social media. News headlines followed fast, filled with heavy words. Aggression at 30,000 feet, outrage in the sky, scandal strikes Liberty Air. By late afternoon, opinion pieces were everywhere. Cable news ran split-screen debates with lawyers, sociologists, and flight industry veterans, trying to figure out exactly how a moment like that could happen. Some argued that Teresa had simply snapped under pressure, pushed to the edge by stress and disrespect. Others insisted the deeper story couldn't be ignored, that it wasn't just a slap, but a mirror reflecting an unspoken pattern. Because Arturo Delgado was Latino, soft-spoken, dressed simply, and not immediately recognizable as a CEO, people questioned if assumptions had played a role, if things might have gone differently had he looked or sounded more like what many expected from someone in power. That question touched a nerve. Liberty Air, which had only recently renamed itself as a symbol of its new commitment to global inclusion and equity, now found itself at the center of a controversy that struck at everything it claimed to stand for. The company's first press release was vague. They mentioned an incident and said it was under internal review, but the lack of clarity just made things worse. Customers posted screenshots of ticket cancellations. Employees began sharing anonymous stories online. The company's silence became its own kind of answer. Inside his hotel room that night, Arturo turned off the TV mid-commentary and picked up his phone. "Laura," he said when his personal assistant answered, "I need access to every internal conduct report and training evaluation from the last 5 years, flight staff, ground crews, management. Whatever we have." Laura hesitated. "That's hundreds of documents. What are you looking for exactly?" "Patterns," he replied. "Not noise, just the places where the system starts to crack." He wasn't trying to punish anyone publicly. He wasn't filming another statement or preparing lawsuits. He wanted to know if this moment was just one mistake or part of a chain reaction no one had stopped soon enough to prevent. For Arturo, symbolic justice meant little. He was looking for the root, not the surface. In the days that followed, the incident, Teresa found herself at home, suspended from her duties while investigations unfolded. At first, she was angry, convinced that she, not Arturo, had been the one wronged. Sitting at her kitchen table, cup of black coffee in hand, she recorded a short video on her phone. In it, she explained that the passenger in question had spoken to her with a tone she found aggressive, even dismissive. She didn't name him, of course. She still didn't know who he was. She just said her reaction was human, not hateful. The clip made its way around the company and picked up views quickly. Online, some believed her. Comments filled with support started showing up under her posts, many from current and former Liberty Air employees who felt the recent push toward diversity and inclusion had gone too far. These voices weren't loud in public meetings, but in private forums they grumbled about how everything had suddenly become about political correctness. They backed Teresa with phrases like, "She was only doing her job, and this new culture is just making people soft." Teresa joined a group of employees who, like her, felt overlooked or pushed aside by Liberty Air's transformation. It gave her something to hold on to while the storm brewed around her. Still, something didn't sit right. Even if she convinced others that she had been justified, a part of her, one she wasn't ready to face, didn't feel as sure. A week later, she was sitting in HR, waiting for a routine check-in related to her suspension. The receptionist, a young woman named Clarissa, walked past with her laptop open, pausing as she answered a quick question from a co-worker. On the screen was an internal newsletter from company leadership. Teresa barely noticed, until she caught sight of a photo on the screen. Her breath hitching, she leaned closer. It was him. The man in seat 3A, calm, respectful, the same man she had struck. The caption below the photo read, "Arturo Delgado, CEO of Liberty Air, speaks on ethical leadership and empathy at NY headquarters." A cold wave ran down her back. She could barely hear the voices around her anymore. Shame gripped her so hard she felt rooted to the floor. All the excuses she'd made blurred at once. She had hit the company's top leader. And yet, even then, she didn't know how to say sorry, or if it would matter. Arturo sat in the cafe space on the 12th floor of Liberty Air's Manhattan headquarters, early as always. The coffee machine hissed in the quiet morning, and a few office staff passed by with curious glances. He had chosen this spot on purpose. It was open, comfortable, not one of those cold meeting rooms with chairs too straight and walls too white. He didn't want confrontation. He wanted a conversation. About 15 minutes after the hour, Teresa walked in. She looked different. Not physically, same posture, same sharp eyes, but her energy had shifted. She moved slowly, like someone walking into a room half expecting to be handed her final warning. She spotted Arturo at a corner table and paused, unsure. He gave a nod and gestured to the chair in front of him. "Hi," he said, with a warmth she wasn't prepared for. "Hi," she replied, guarded. They sat for a few seconds in silence, the kind that felt heavy but not hostile. She braced for judgment, maybe a long speech about values or a polite dismissal, but it didn't come. Arturo simply asked, "How are you holding up?" That wasn't what she expected. Her throat tightened. "I've been better," she said, a half laugh that didn't really land. He nodded again. No notebook, no assistant taking notes, just a cup of black coffee. Then, without prompting, she started to talk. She ended up sharing more than she thought she would. About the red-eye flights where passengers yelled racial slurs, about cleaning up vomit without a thank you. About being pinned against the back galley once by a drunk man and reporting it, only to hear from her manager, "He's a platinum, just let it go." 21 years of turbulence, not just in the air but inside. She hadn't planned to say all that, but something about Arturo, his steady quiet, the way he truly listened, unlocked it. She admitted she sometimes numbed herself during flights, stopped seeing people in front of her as individuals. That, what started as a survival mechanism, had become habit. Arturo didn't interrupt. When she finished, he leaned forward just slightly. "We've been asking people to change how they work," he said, "but maybe we forgot to ask how they're doing, really." It wasn't forgiveness he offered, but something maybe even more rare, space to shift. And for the first time in a long while, Teresa felt she didn't have to keep her armor on. Calls started pouring in within days of Arturo's quiet meeting with Teresa. The public still wanted answers. The video hadn't gone away. It floated across networks and social feeds like it was fresh each time someone shared it. Liberty Air's board of directors, uneasy with the way the matter had dragged on, called an emergency session. Words like optics and brand safety were tossed around the way cabin crews say, "bumpy ride." They wanted swift action, a press statement with Arturo's name under it. A clear move to show that the company didn't tolerate misconduct, especially one caught on camera. Most of all, they wanted Teresa gone. Clean break, no hesitation, classic damage control. But Arturo didn't go along so easily. He leaned back in his chair during the call, one hand rubbing his temple, the other scribbling, something meaningless on a yellow notepad. After the fourth board member pushed the same idea, public apology, public firing, he finally spoke. "Firing her makes it look like we fixed the problem," he said, steady but tired. "But it just pushes it out of view, doesn't fix anything." One of the senior members on the line snapped, "With all due respect, Arturo, this is not the time for nuance." "Maybe that's exactly what this time needs," he replied. Tension rose after that meeting. Emails came loaded with passive-aggressive phrases. Stock analysts speculated about company direction. Arturo knew what could happen if investors pulled back. He had read this script before, but instead of reacting publicly, he turned inward. He spent nights watching old corporate training sessions, ones most people had forgotten even existed, stored in folders no one opened in years. He watched employee role-play videos, customer service feedback recordings, and debriefs from conflict resolution workshops. One thing kept standing out: a pattern. Across multiple years, from different locations, the same flagged alerts. Most incidents where black or brown customers were involved led to quicker escalation, more suspensions, more use of force reports. Complaints often lingered in inboxes unanswered unless someone had status. It wasn't about one bad moment. It was cultural. It was systemic. So Arturo stopped thinking about headlines. He started sketching a different kind of report, one nobody asked for, mapping the cracks that had been covered by slogans. He wasn't begging for praise. He was preparing for a change slower than outrage, but deeper than spin. Laura had always been one of the first to arrive at headquarters, often with a green tea in one hand and her tablet already loaded with calendar updates and flagged emails. As Arturo's personal assistant, she'd spent over 6 years learning how to anticipate his needs before he said them out loud. So when things began to spiral after the flight scandal, she naturally worked longer hours, helped filter the noise, and acted as a quiet shield against the chaos. That was around the time Diego entered the picture. Diego Torres, Liberty's marketing director, was charming in a way that felt effortless. He had this easy laugh, knew everyone's name in the office, and talked about inclusion like it came from somewhere real. He'd swing by Laura's desk with silly jokes or recommend a new podcast about company culture. And at first, it wasn't flirting, it felt like connection. What started as after-work coffees quickly turned into dinners and weekends where work wasn't mentioned at all. For once, Laura didn't have to be the one carrying everything. She let herself lean in. But then things changed. Diego started avoiding briefings he had once volunteered to lead. Laura noticed a series of late-night messages sent and immediately deleted. He grew cagey whenever Arturo's name came up. Once, when he left his laptop screen unlocked next to her, she caught the end of an email being encrypted, something no one outside cybersecurity typically used. At first, she tried to explain it away. Maybe he was still trying to impress the board after being passed over for promotions last quarter, but her gut told her more than that. One evening, while Arturo was stuck in back-to-back meetings, Laura used her clearance to check the internal record logs and document tracking system. What she found chilled her. Diego had pulled confidential summaries from leadership sessions, some of which no one outside Arturo's immediate circle should have seen. Email traces suggested contact with 2 business journalists, both known for running company exposés. It wasn't just carelessness. It was intentional. Diego was feeding the press, shaping a narrative that questioned Arturo's judgment and strength. Laura sat frozen at her desk, torn in two directions. One path led to comfort, to someone who made her laugh and feel seen. The other led to responsibility, to the loyalty that had guided her through her entire career. She knew she couldn't walk both. Teresa sat across from Arturo again, this time in one of the smaller conference rooms near the back of the Liberty Air building. The space was quiet, tucked away from the steady movement of meetings and hallway chatter. Arturo had invited her back, not for a formal hearing, but for what he called a real conversation, no audience. She agreed, although this time she came prepared. Tucked inside her bag was her personal phone, already set to record. The fear of becoming a scapegoat hung over her, even after everything. There was no trust yet, not fully. As much as she'd shared with him earlier, part of her still felt exposed, still unsure if empathy would hold when the pressure returned. At the beginning, she asked if she could speak freely. Arturo nodded. She reached without a word into her purse and tapped the screen of her phone. He noticed, but said nothing. As she talked, she didn't hold back. She spoke about her early days with the airline, how everything seemed to fall on flight crews when things went wrong. She told him about the weight of being stuck between customer demands and company policies, the quiet insults disguised as questions, the constant need to prove herself capable while never allowed to be emotional. But as she continued, she found her own voice shifting. Arturo didn't interrupt. He just listened. That quiet presence again, without judgment, was somehow louder than a room full of voices. And as she looked at him, not as a CEO, not as some abstract figure of power, but as a man quietly holding space, something inside her started to shift. In the middle of a sentence, she reached across the table and stopped the recording. The room stayed still. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. When the silence gave way again, it wasn't about the incident. It was about all the little things, the thousands of moments they'd each witnessed, small slights in boardrooms, smirks in staff lounges, the way some passengers ignored her completely unless they were angry. Arturo shared his own memories too, from dinners where he had to repeat his credentials just to be taken seriously, to meetings where his calm was mistaken for being detached. That afternoon, something cracked open. Teresa left the room not feeling defeated, but clear. That night she sat at home and opened the new training materials Arturo had quietly uploaded across departments. And for the first time in over 20 years on the job, she watched not as a seasoned worker resisting one more task, but as someone genuinely trying to learn. A few weeks after the storms of press and boardroom tension, Arturo called a meeting with the department heads and pitched something that made almost everyone tilt their heads, a simulation-based training program using professional actors. Not actors reading from a script in a dull conference room, but performers, trained to push buttons, bring emotion, and mimic real passengers in high-stress scenarios. The goal wasn't to test procedures, it was to test people, how they listened, how they responded, how quickly their assumptions kicked in. Most of his team looked uncomfortable. Some muttered about cost. It wasn't cheap to hire actors full-time for a rotating pilot. Others worried about morale. What if it backfired? But Arturo didn't flinch. It was time, he said, to stop pretending that a few slides and videos could shift bitterness built over decades. The first session was held in a warehouse space near Liberty's logistics hub in Newark. Actors played fussy passengers, entitled executives, elderly travelers confused about security policies, and even one furious teenager filming everything on his phone. No one was warned what to expect. And it worked. People cried, argued, laughed nervously. Others stood totally still, wrecked by scenes that mirrored things they'd buried or brushed off. What surprised Arturo the most, though, was the feedback afterward. Team members, from office workers to gate agents, said the training didn't feel like a lecture. It felt like recognition, like someone was finally naming the real tension they carried into every shift. Then came something even more unexpected. Teresa showed up. She had volunteered for the second round before anyone else signed up. Many of her co-workers were stunned. Some assumed she'd show up defensive or treat the whole thing like performance. But when the session began, Teresa held her own, and not just in the role-playing. She listened. During debriefing circles after each simulation, she spoke carefully, sometimes pausing when emotion crept in. And when others hesitated to talk, she gently encouraged them. In the days that followed, she started organizing her own weekly circles, inviting baggage handlers, flight attendants, and even the overnight cleaning crews. There were no fancy agendas, just a few folding chairs and honest questions. Nobody was expected to agree, only to speak and hear each other, and she didn't stand at the front. She sat beside them for the first time fully there. Laura hadn't slept properly in days. The evidence she'd gathered filled 2 folders, one on a flash drive and another, just in case, printed and hidden in the back of her planner. She had double-checked everything: email metadata, meeting logs, private messages copied before they vanished. Each piece led unmistakably back to Diego. In public, he remained all smiles, still walking hallways with that familiar charm. But Laura saw through it now. What broke her wasn't just the betrayal of Arturo or the company. It was personal. She had let him into her apartment, into her thoughts, even into her guarded routines, that he could hold her hand one night and send damaging intel the next. This she hadn't prepared for. On a grey Monday morning, Laura walked into Arturo's office, asked for 10 minutes, and closed the door behind her. She didn't try to build a case with big words or a clever pitch. She just handed him both folders, and then, as he opened them, she finally let go. "I didn't want it to be true," she said, her voice cracking. "I kept hoping I was wrong." Arturo didn't say much, not at first. He flipped through the prints, face steady, then turned to his screen and pulled up internal access logs to confirm timestamps matched. What he found only made Laura's suspicions more real. He looked across the desk at her, his most trusted assistant, the person who had bent time more than once to keep the company standing. And in that moment, everything shifted. By Friday, the Liberty Board was called back into an emergency meeting. Arturo didn't shout or posture. He simply laid out the facts. Leaks tied directly to Diego's access, manipulated reports, divide-and-conquer tactics built to fracture trust among departments. The same board that had once pressured Arturo to fire Teresa now looked straight at Diego. Within hours, his contract was suspended pending investigation. He didn't even clean out his office himself. The fallout was quick, but for Laura, slower somehow. Being at the center of it all left her exposed, raw. Yet something else happened too. Staff who had always kept their distance now stopped by her desk with quiet nods. People remembered not just the folders she brought in, but the years she'd worked behind every leader and flight schedule the company had built. And for the first time, her silence wasn't her strength. Her voice was. By the time Teresa walked into the NBC studios in Manhattan, she already knew what she was going to say. She'd rehearsed it a dozen times in her head, then stopped rehearsing altogether. None of it sounded right when it was too polished. This wasn't supposed to be cleaned up. The producers of Morning Today, the most-watched talk show in the country, had invited her for what they pitched as a conversation about change. But Teresa wasn't interested in softening the moment. She'd seen the headlines die down. The company was moving forward. Arturo's training programs were expanding. And still, something inside her stayed unsettled. She sat under the bright, Studio lights across from Jorge Silva, the kind of host who was known for steering around discomfort with easy banter. But as he smiled and eased into the segment, Teresa interrupted. "I need to say something before we talk about anything else," she began, voice clearer than she thought it would be. Jorge blinked, caught off guard. She took a breath. "I was racist, not because I hated anyone, but because I took certain things for granted. I assumed, I judged, I reacted without thinking." Silence hung in the studio, but she didn't fill it. "I confused following orders with doing the right thing. I confused being firm with being fair. I didn't see it at the time, because I never had to see it." Her voice didn't shake. No tears, no drama, just the kind of quiet that pressed in on itself. By that afternoon, the clip had gone viral. Not because she cried or made a performance of regret, but because she named something most people dance around, and because she did it before anyone could frame it for her. The backlash came fast. Some of her former co-workers accused her of turning on the industry. Posts labeled her attention-seeking, weak. Others said she had embarrassed the company, undermined their efforts to move past the scandal. But then the messages started coming in, slow at first, then steady. Teenagers from across the country wrote about similar moments they'd witnessed at airports, schools, stores. Old teammates sent notes saying they remembered shifts they'd brushed off and were now rethinking them. One passenger even said, "Seeing you helped me see myself." Her words didn't fix everything, but they cracked the door open where others had kept it closed, and that, in the end, was enough. Arturo had kept his silence longer than anyone expected. In interviews, he'd always let the company statements speak for themselves. When reporters asked him why he hadn't commented on the incident that shook Liberty Air months ago, he simply said it wasn't time yet. Even after the internal reforms, the firings, and the new training programs, he remained quiet about the one thing everyone speculated: who had been the unidentified passenger on that flight, the one caught in the middle of the whole mess. Then, on a clear Thursday morning, Arturo stepped in front of a row of microphones at the company's New York headquarters. No dramatic music, no preamble, just a quiet, steady moment that interrupted the noise. He wore a dark blue suit, nothing flashy, and looked out at a packed room of reporters. Cameras clicked non-stop. Behind him, the Liberty Air logo stood centered against a plain white wall. He didn't read from a script. "I was the passenger," he began calmly. The room went still. Arturo looked out at the sea of blinking lights and open notepads. "I didn't come forward that day because I didn't want my presence to change the story. Not yet. I needed to see how this company would respond, not to a top executive in trouble, but to a vulnerable, nameless person sitting in row 14. He paused. Let it settle. Being a black man in charge of a major airline in this country is like walking on double glass. On one side, I am invisible to those above me who assume I must have come up through a special program or landed here by luck. On the other, I'm questioned endlessly by those who think I don't belong, even after I've proven myself again and again." He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry or weary, just real. I held back because I needed to understand what we were really building here, whether the foundation was solid or just looked nice from the outside. The clip rolled across every major network that afternoon. Social feeds filled with comments and clips shared with notes like, "Finally, and now I get it." It struck a chord that no crisis management campaign ever could. Because Arturo didn't speak to protect the company, he spoke to show everyone who he was. And somehow, in a moment built for headlines, he reminded the country how powerful it is when someone chooses truth over status, and the country, for once, listened quietly and believed him. A few weeks after Arturo's public statement, things inside Liberty Air began to settle. Or so it seemed. Departments had taken to the changes in varying degrees. Some leaned in, organizing weekly check-ins and continuing the dialogue Teresa started. Others nodded publicly, but carried quiet resentment just beneath the surface. Then the audit file came in. It wasn't flagged with urgency at first, just one of the routine internal reviews, being done as part of the new transparency phase. But buried in the last section of the report was a note about a meal request. Arturo's special dietary order, placed for a cross-country flight weeks earlier, had never been fulfilled. That part had felt like a small oversight at the time, something brushed off, but the audit showed it wasn't an accident. The system showed a manual deletion. The digital trail led back to a single staff login. It wasn't hard to match the ID with a name, an employee from the operations team, a long-time worker who rarely voiced his concerns publicly but had been openly dismissive about the new inclusive initiatives in off-record chats. In his weekly evaluations, he kept things surface level, polite, cooperative. But this quiet gesture, removing the CEO's meal request, was aimed to make a point. According to excerpts from private messages between him and a former colleague, he wanted to show that all this sensitivity training stuff doesn't fix real things. It was a small act, but deliberate, and it hit deeper, not because of its scale, but because of what it symbolized. Senior leaders expected Arturo to act quickly and remove the employee. There was enough proof to make the call. But instead, Arturo asked for something different. He wanted to hold a company-wide panel, an internal forum where this case would be discussed openly, no closed doors, no edited statement on workplace misconduct. He called it a space for real consequences through real conversations. It was uncomfortable for everyone, but it forced people to stop whispering and start asking real questions about intent, about harm, about what resistance actually looked like. Nobody defended the act, but when people heard the employee speak, nervous, cornered but honest, what came through was a deeper tension. Not justification, but fear. Fear of change. Fear of losing status. And that's what Arturo had wanted to expose. Not just the act, but the reason behind it, and maybe, just maybe, begin to change it. Teresa was sorting through boarding passes at the LaGuardia terminal when the email came through. Subject line, "Invitation to join Liberty Air's new Internal Ethics Commission." She read it twice, then once more, just to be sure. At 52, having spent her entire career inside airports but rarely in meetings that mattered, she never saw something like this coming her way. The message was formal, but not cold. It said her name had come up more than once in recent months, mentioned by ground teams, flight crews, and even Arturo himself. Her handling of conversations during the role-play trainings, her bravery on national television, and her quiet leadership in hallway talks had created space people didn't realize they needed. The commission, they said, was being formed to guide ethical decisions from within, not just react to mistakes after they happened. Teresa sat there for a long time, hands still resting on her tablet, just staring at the screen. Honestly, she wasn't sure. The idea of sitting in judgment of others on complex, messy situations felt heavy. She had made her own mistakes more than once. Some still stung when she thought about them. Being part of a team deciding what's right sounded like a seat she wasn't sure she deserved. That night at home, her daughter asked what it was she was hesitating about. Teresa just said, "Justice is hard when you know how often you've gotten it wrong yourself." But slowly, the quiet turned to reflection. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the ones who had struggled the most to change were the ones who needed to be in the room, the ones who had learned the hard way how to stop defending their own comfort and start listening. When she replied to the invitation 2 days later, she included one condition. "I'd like to continue flying once a week," she wrote. "Just short domestic runs, out by morning, back by evening. When someone from HR called to ask why, she just said, "It reminds me to stay grounded, that we all start the same, boarding from some gate, trying to get somewhere better." They agreed, and now, in between summits and reviews, Teresa still takes a weekly flight. Somewhere between seatbelt clicks and cabin announcements, she finds space to breathe, and to remember that understanding doesn't come from sitting above, but from walking among. Over at the main office in Chicago, Laura was settling into her new role as head of human development, a title that had never existed at Liberty Air before, but now suddenly felt essential. The announcement had gone out just days after the internal trial Arturo had proposed. Some praised the decision, others not so much. From the outside, it looked like recognition. The woman who had exposed Diego's sabotage and helped turn the tide of the company was finally stepping out from the wings. But things weren't as clean inside the office walls. Several co-workers who once shared coffee with her every morning now took the long way around her desk. Small meetings ended without eye contact. A couple of team leaders stopped looping her in on quick project updates. Nobody said anything directly, but the message was clear enough. Some people thought she had climbed over someone else to get where she was. Laura had expected some backlash. She just didn't realize how cold it would feel. It wasn't about liking Diego. Most didn't know him well, but something about blowing the whistle made her, in their eyes, unpredictable, dangerous even. She hadn't just called out a colleague. She had broken the silent rule that said, "You keep things inside the family." Still, she came in early every morning, reviewed case files that had been buried in HR folders for years, and met with frontline staff to better understand the real gaps, places where people didn't speak up because they didn't trust the process would protect them. Instead of pushing her new title around, Laura started small. She introduced Anonymous, feedback forms that didn't end up in a supervisor's inbox. She set up a standing drop-in hour every Wednesday afternoon for employees who just wanted to talk. No strings, no reports required. Slowly, people trickled in. One day, a flight supervisor told her, "I've worked here 16 years and never had someone in your position ask if we feel safe speaking freely." Laura nodded, not because it was a compliment, but because it gave her something real to shape things around. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was trying to be the kind of guide she wished she'd had when she almost backed down, and didn't. The kind who listened clearly, acted fairly, and kept showing up even when the smiles faded. And over time, the distance began to close. Not overnight, but it did. The headquarters of Liberty Air in downtown Chicago didn't change overnight, but little by little it began to feel different. It wasn't just the rearranged furniture or the updated lighting, though those had their part too. What really shifted was the feel of the place. The cold, echoey halls that once made everything sound sharper than it should now carried a softer kind of energy, like the noise had been replaced by something closer to real listening. It started with the walls, not the big lobby ones with the polished logos and stock photos of smiling crews. Those stayed for now. But the back hallways, the ones between departments where people only passed through, became something new. A group of interns from the employee engagement team asked workers to submit anonymous reflections about their time at the company. And from that, murals started to go up. Not art for art's sake, but real quotes, honest words printed clean, across the walls in simple block letters. There were phrases in English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, and other languages you didn't always see in a corporate space. One said, "I stayed even when it got hard because I believed it could change." Another said, "We talk a lot. Now we walk too." And near the Eco Lounge by the 5th floor, a quote from Arturo stood by itself in neat black lettering. We don't want applause for what we promise. We want respect for what we're willing to rebuild. That line had first appeared in a quiet email he'd sent to the Ethics Commission months earlier. Someone had passed it along to the mural team, thinking it captured something too honest to keep buried. At first, folks weren't sure what to make of the listening circles that started popping up every Thursday. There were no speeches, no outcomes, no reports, just chairs in a wide circle and a few handwritten questions on a whiteboard. But people came, not everyone, but more than anyone expected. From flight crews to accounting staff, people started telling small truths, things that usually sat buried under the pressure to sound professional. Week by week, the mood in the building changed, not with one big announcement, but with a lot of small, steady actions. The building didn't forget what it had been. It just stopped pretending that was enough. Teresa stepped onto the jet bridge at gate B19 just after 7 in the morning. It was her usual Thursday flight to Austin, a short hop from Chicago, the kind of route that didn't draw much attention. But today felt different. It was her first time back in uniform since she had taken on the role with the Ethics Commission. And even though she'd promised herself it would feel normal, it didn't. Not yet. The cabin was still waking up. A few passengers were already settled, headphones on, eyes closed. 2 children in row 6 argued quietly over who got the window seat. A man tried to shove an oversized roller into a bin, clearly not designed for it. The usual early flight rhythm that Teresa knew by heart, but this time she didn't float through it on autopilot. As A's, she moved up the aisle doing the mental checks, seat belts, overhead bins, tray tables. She made a point to meet each set of eyes. And when she did, something caught in her throat. It wasn't nerves exactly. It was more like recognition. In the expressions of the passengers, some tired, some anxious, some half asleep, she didn't just see strangers. She saw parts of herself, who she had been in this job 20 years ago, who she'd become since everything changed, and maybe who she was still trying to be. Midway through the flight, while preparing coffee near the back galley, she looked up and noticed her reflection in the shiny oven door. It stopped her. Same face, same uniform, but something felt different, and not just on the surface. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was just running through the motions. Her gestures, handing a cup of water, adjusting a blanket, answering a question about the landing time, weren't just tasks anymore. They were choices, opportunities to connect, not perform. And when an older black woman in row 12 gently touched her hand during drink service and said, "Thank you for everything you've done," Teresa nodded. But she couldn't find words right away. Her chest tightened and tears welled, slow and quiet. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't praise. It was just a shared understanding between 2 people in a small space. For the first time in years, she felt completely inside the uniform, not hiding behind it. Arturo didn't tell anyone he was flying. No assistants, no board members, not even the Ethics Commission. It was better this way. He wanted to see the changes for himself, not in a meeting room or through a report, but in the air, where everything Liberty Air was supposed to stand for met reality. He booked a ticket under his mother's maiden name, chose a middle seat in economy, and carried only a small backpack. No one gave him a second glance at the gate. That's exactly what he hoped for. It was a short flight to Minneapolis, one of the older routes in the system, but he chose it because it was ordinary. No special guests on board, no inspectors, just everyday passengers trying to make a connection or get home. Arturo settled into seat 23B, between a guy in a hoodie playing games on his phone and a retired couple flipping through a crossword. The moment she stepped into the aisle, he spotted her. Teresa, straight-backed, sleeves just slightly rolled, moving row by row with a calm that came more from presence than from training. She hadn't changed much, and yet something about her felt different now. When she reached his row and met his eyes, recognition flashed. But she didn't make a scene, she just smiled, brief, honest, no surprise, no tension. Just a quiet hello that said she knew, and that was enough. He nodded back. A few minutes later, she came by offering drinks. "Coffee?" she asked, like she would with anyone. He accepted. No need for words. It wasn't a test anymore, not really. It was the final page of a long story they had written together, each in their own way. As he held the warm paper cup, Arturo looked out the window, though all he could see was the wings slicing through grey clouds. Still, something inside him settled. Not every change they'd aimed for had landed perfectly. Some people had left. Some mistakes had taken too long to fix. But here, in row 23, something simple was true. The culture wasn't just surviving, it was breathing, real, carried daily by the people who believed in it. And for an hour in the sky, he didn't have to lead. He just had to be there. By the time spring rolled around, the empathy-based leadership program that Liberty Air had quietly launched a year earlier was gaining real attention, not just from employees inside the company, but from outside too. Airlines from Detroit, Dallas, even one from Toronto started reaching out, asking to visit, take notes, maybe send a few managers to observe. No one was asking about profit margins or cost cuts. The conversations were about culture, how it was shifting, how people were staying longer, speaking more openly, stepping into roles they once avoided. It surprised Arturo at first, how something that started as damage control had grown into something others wanted to learn from. But that was the thing about change done the hard way. It lasted longer than press releases or polished mission statements. The real wins were subtle, less turnover among flight attendants, fewer complaints sitting unresolved, more team leads, holding space instead of holding grudges. Inside Liberty Air, people began to recognize that leadership wasn't just tied to rank. The program offered sessions on listening without interruption, handling feedback that stung, and, maybe most important, how to guide without needing to control. It wasn't a magical fix, but it created room for better decisions. Room for people to show up fully, even when things got uncomfortable. Arturo watched all of this unfold with a quiet kind of pride, the way someone might smile at a garden they didn't plant alone but had helped water. And as more systems began running smoothly, without him needing to intervene, he knew something else with clarity. It was time to step aside. He didn't want to stay until people got tired of him. He wanted to leave while trust was strong and momentum was forward. Legacy wasn't about being remembered forever. It was about leaving people better prepared than when you found them. So he began meeting with potential successors, not only from upper management, but a few from unexpected places. A former baggage supervisor, a flight attendant with a law degree, people who'd learned to listen before they shouted, who understood firmness didn't cancel out kindness, who knew that real justice didn't always start with punishment. It started with courage, courage to repair, not just to remove. Arturo wasn't walking away. He was stepping back so the next voice at the table would be heard. And that, he believed, was the truest mark of leadership. The training hall at Liberty Air's Chicago Learning Center was filled with a kind of energy that didn't come from charts or speeches. Folding chairs lined the walls, families chatted softly in English, Spanish, and a few other languages. A playlist of upbeat songs played low in the background. On the main floor, a group of new company leaders stood in colorful outfits borrowed, gifted or borrowed again, clothes from family traditions most had never shared at work before. They'd come from different corners of the country and brought parts of their culture forward, piecing together a closing event like no one had really expected. Someone had the idea weeks earlier during a group discussion about belonging. Why not tell our stories without words? One of the team leads had asked. And now here they were, dancing, laughing, clapping along to rhythms from Houston, from Queens, from Little Haiti, from Albuquerque. The room wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Teresa was right there in the middle of it. She wore a bright scarf from her grandmother's old Sunday church wardrobe and moved in time with the others. Her laugh came easily, not like a forced performance, but from somewhere more solid. She hadn't felt that grounded in years, maybe not ever. Somewhere along the way, between struggle and healing, she had found her place. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she had stayed long enough to build it herself. Near the back wall, standing away from the crowd, Arturo leaned casually against a beam, watching the celebration unfold. He wasn't trying to be noticed. He didn't need to be. The soft orange light of sunset poured through the tall windows, catching his face unevenly. It made no difference. He was no longer the center of the room, and that was exactly how it should be. He smiled, not as a man checking boxes or calculating outcomes, but as someone who had poured years into something fragile and watched it stretch into something real. He didn't feel sadness, only stillness. A quiet goodbye wrapped in music, movement, and possibility. Without any formal speech, he turned, walked down the hallway, and exited through the side door. Outside, the wind was light, the sky wide open. The work would continue. The people were ready, and the story, without needing permission, had already taken flight.